They did not know it yet, but this would be the moment when an empire bled out at sea. Before dawn on October 23, 1944, the Pacific Ocean was unnaturally calm. The water off the Philippines looked almost peaceful, reflecting a sky that gave no warning of what was coming. Beneath that calm surface, steel giants were already moving, hundreds of ships, thousands of guns, and over 200,000 sailors converging toward a single point on the map. This was not just another battle. It would become the largest naval battle in human history. And almost no one involved fully understood how close it came to ending in total disaster. The United States Navy believed the Japanese fleet was finished. After years of relentless defeats, Midway, Guadalcanal, the Marianas, the Imperial Japanese Navy appeared broken. Its pilots were dead, its fuel was scarce, and its once proud battleships were shadows of their former power. But Japan was about to gamble everything it had left, because in October 1944, the Americans were returning to the Philippines. General Douglas MacArthur had promised, "I shall return." Now he had. U.S. troops were landing on the island of Leyte, and if Japan lost the Philippines, it would lose access to oil from Southeast Asia. Without oil, Japan's war would end. The Japanese High Command understood this perfectly, and so they devised a plan so desperate, so reckless, that it bordered on suicide. It was called Shogo 1. The plan was simple in theory and insane in execution. Lure the U.S. Navy away from the invasion beaches, then smash the American transport fleet while it was defenseless. To do this, Japan would split its remaining navy into multiple forces, sending decoys north, attack groups south, and a massive battleship force straight through the center. It was a plan that assumed perfect timing, perfect coordination, and perfect luck. Japan had none of those things left. Yet, somehow, the plan nearly worked. The American invasion fleet at Leyte Gulf was enormous. Over 700 ships, troop transports, supply vessels, escort carriers, destroyers, battleships. It was the beating heart of the Pacific war effort. If Japan could destroy those transports, tens of thousands of American soldiers would be stranded or killed. The invasion would collapse. The war could drag on for years. But the Americans believed the Japanese fleet was too weak to attempt such a counterattack. That belief would almost cost them everything. The first shots of the battle were fired not by aircraft or battleships, but by submarines. On October 23rd, 2 American submarines, USS Darter and USS Dace, were lurking in the Palawan Passage when they detected a massive Japanese force moving through the strait. It was the center force, commanded by Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, and included some of the most powerful warships ever built. Among them were the Yamato and Musashi. The Yamato-class battleships were monsters. Each displaced over 70,000 tons and carried 18.1-inch guns, the largest naval guns ever mounted on a warship. One shell from Yamato could weigh as much as a small car. Kurita's force was meant to punch straight through the American lines. The submarine struck first. Torpedoes slammed into Japanese cruisers, sinking 2 and damaging a third. Kurita survived, but the warning should have been clear. The Americans were watching. What followed over the next 4 days was not one battle, but 4 separate naval engagements, spread across hundreds of miles of ocean, fought almost simultaneously. Confusion would become the defining feature. Admirals would make decisions based on incomplete information. Fleets would chase ghosts. Messages would be delayed, misunderstood, or ignored. And in one moment that still haunts naval historians, the most powerful fleet in the world would turn away from a group of helpless American ships, believing the real enemy lay elsewhere. On October 24th, American aircraft found Kurita's center force in the Sibuyan Sea. Wave after wave of U.S. carrier planes attacked. Bombs and torpedoes rained down on the Japanese ships, and the Musashi became their primary target. Again and again, she was hit. Torpedoes tore into her hull. Bombs shattered her decks. Fires raged uncontrolled. The Musashi absorbed punishment that would have sunk any other ship. But by evening, even she could no longer fight the ocean. She rolled over and sank, taking more than 1,000 sailors with her. Kurita turned his force west, retreating. At least that's what the American believed. This assumption would prove nearly fatal. While Kurita appeared to withdraw, Another Japanese force was moving into position to the south. And to the north, Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa was sailing with a fleet of aircraft carriers that barely had any planes. These carriers were bait. Ozawa's mission was to sacrifice his fleet to draw the American fast carriers away from Leyte Gulf. And it worked. Admiral William Bull Halsey, commanding the U.S. Third Fleet, took the bait completely. Believing Kurita was retreating and convinced Ozawa's carriers were the main threat, Halsey took his entire powerful fleet north in pursuit. He left the invasion beaches exposed. No one told the small escort carrier groups guarding Leyte Gulf that they were now alone. At dawn on October 25th, sailors aboard a tiny American task group known as Taffy 3 saw something on the horizon that made no sense. Tall pagoda masts, gun flashes, battleships. They were staring straight at Kurita's center force. For battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. Against them stood 6 small escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. The American ships were never meant to fight battleships. Their carriers were slow. Their planes were armed mostly for ground support. Their largest guns were 5 inches. The Japanese guns were 18 inches. It should have been a massacre. And yet, something extraordinary happened. The American sailors did not run. They attacked. Destroyers charged directly at the Japanese line, launching torpedoes at point-blank range, laying smoke screens, firing until their guns overheated. Pilots took off with whatever weapons they had, some with depth charges, some with machine guns only, and attacked anyway. The sea erupted in chaos. Shells fell like buildings collapsing from the sky. Ships vanished in explosions. And through the smoke and confusion, Kurita began to lose his nerve. He believed he was facing a much larger American force. He believed Halsey's fleet would return at any moment. He did not realize he was fighting some of the weakest ships in the U.S. Navy. And then, at the moment when victory was finally within his grasp, Kurita ordered retreat. Historians still struggle to explain that decision. The Japanese had a clear path to the American invasion fleet, but the chance was gone. By October 26, the Battle of Leyte Gulf was over. Japan had lost 4 aircraft carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. The Imperial Japanese Navy would never again conduct a major operation. The era of battleships had ended, and the Pacific War was effectively decided. But the most shocking truth of Leyte Gulf remains this. The largest naval battle in history was won not by perfect planning or overwhelming firepower, but by confusion, courage, and decisions made in moments of absolute uncertainty. And if just one of those decisions had gone differently, World War II might have lasted far longer than anyone expected. The sea did not go quiet after Kurita turned away. If anything, the chaos only deepened. While the battered American escort carriers and destroyers of Taffy 3 were still fighting for survival off Samar, hundreds of miles away, another desperate battle was unfolding in the narrow waters of Surigao Strait. There, history was about to circle back on itself in a way no one could have planned. The Japanese Southern Force, commanded by Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura, was pushing north of the strait under cover of darkness. His mission was to break into Leyte Gulf from the south and join Kurita's center force in destroying the American landing fleet. But Nishimura was sailing into a trap. Waiting for him was the U.S. 7th Fleet, commanded by Admiral Thomas Kincaid, with battleships that had been sunk or damaged earlier in the war, Pearl Harbor veterans that had been repaired, modernized, and brought back from the dead, West Virginia, Tennessee, California, Maryland, Mississippi, Pennsylvania. These ships had scars. They also had radar. As Nishimura's force entered the narrow strait in the early hours of October 25th, American destroyers struck first. Torpedoes cut through the darkness, slamming into Japanese ships with devastating effect. One battleship, Fuso, was torn apart, exploding so violently that survivors later swore the ship had split in 2. The Japanese formation dissolved into confusion, but Nishimura pressed forward anyway. He had orders, and retreat was unthinkable. Then the American battleships opened fire. This moment would later be described as the last time in history that battleships crossed each other's T, a classic naval maneuver where one line of ships could unleash full broadsides while the other could apply only with forward guns. Radar-guided salvos lit up the strait. The American guns roared in unison, shell after shell tearing into the remaining Japanese ships. The battleship Yamashiro was battered relentlessly, her superstructure shredded, her decks burning. Within minutes, the southern force was annihilated. Nishimura went down with his ship. Not a single Japanese battleship survived Surigao Strait. It was a complete, crushing victory, but it almost didn't matter, because the most dangerous threat to the American invasion had already come and gone, unnoticed by many of commanders who could have stopped it. Back north, Admiral Halsey was still chasing ghosts. His fast carrier task force had finally caught Ozawa's decoy fleet off Cape Engano. Ozawa's carriers launched what little aircraft they had, but the attacks were ineffective. The American response was overwhelming. Carrier after carrier was bombed, burned, and sunk. By the end of October 25th, Ozawa's fleet had been destroyed. Halsey believed he had won a decisive victory. But even as Japanese ships were sinking beneath him, desperate messages were racing through the Pacific, from the 7th Fleet, from Leyte Gulf, from officers begging for help. One message cut through the confusion with brutal clarity. Where is Task Force 34? It was a question Halsey did not want to answer. Task Force 34, the powerful battleship group that could have blocked Kurita, had never been detached. It had followed Halsey north. The American invasion force had been left exposed. Only the courage of outnumbered sailors had saved it. When Halsey finally realized what had happened, he turned south at full speed. But it was too late. Kurita was already withdrawing. Slipping back through the San Bernardino Strait, his chance lost forever. The Battle of Leyte Gulf was ending, but its consequences were only beginning to sink in. For Japan, the losses were catastrophic. The Imperial Japanese Navy had gambled everything and lost almost everything. Its carrier arm was gone. Its battleship fleet was crippled. Its fuel reserves were nearly exhausted. From this point forward, Japan would never again mount a large-scale naval operation. The ocean, once Japan's greatest shield, had become a grave. For the United States, Leyte Gulf was a victory, but an unsettling one. American commanders quietly studied the battle and saw how close disaster had come, how easily miscommunication, overconfidence, and assumptions could have unraveled everything. And they saw something else. A new kind of warfare was emerging. At Leyte Gulf, battleships had fought their last great engagements, but aircraft had decided the outcome. Radar, submarines, carrier aviation, and destroyers had shaped the battle far more than big guns. The age of the battleship was ending. But perhaps the most haunting legacy of Leyte Gulf was not strategic. It was psychological. Because in the aftermath of the battle, Japan embraced a new doctrine, one born from desperation. If the Navy could no longer win through firepower, it would win through sacrifice. Within weeks, Japanese pilots would begin flying missions from which they were never expected to return. Kamikaze attacks, suicide strikes, made their first organized appearance during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Young pilots, barely trained, were ordered to crash their aircraft into American ships. They were told their deaths would save the empire. For American sailors, the war had just changed forever. Ships that had survived battleships and bombs now faced enemies who did not intend to survive. Fear took on a new shape. And yet, Leyte Gulf had sealed Japan's fate. The Philippines would fall. Supply lines would collapse. The homeland would be exposed. The empire that had once dominated the Pacific was now trapped, bleeding slowly, unable to escape the tightening ring. The largest naval battle in history did not end with a single decisive blow. It ended with exhaustion, with missed chances, with men staring at empty seas where enemy fleets had vanished, and with the quiet realization that the war had entered its final, most terrible phase. At Leyte Gulf, the Japanese Navy did not just lose ships. It lost the ability to shape the war, and the world would never see a naval battle on this scale again. In the days after the guns fell silent, the ocean around Leyte Gulf told its own story. Oil slicks stretched for miles. Broken aircraft floated among lifeboats. Wreckage drifted in slow circles, carried by tides that no longer cared who had won. Thousands of sailors, American and Japanese, were gone, swallowed by the same sea that had carried their fleets into battle. For many of the survivors, it took days to understand what had really happened. American sailors who had fought off Samar were stunned to learn how close they had come to annihilation. Destroyer crews who had charged battleships with guns barely capable of scratching armor quietly realized that courage, not strategy, had saved them. Pilots who had launched with empty bomb racks or depth charges replayed the moment again and again, wondering how fear had not stopped them. On the Japanese side, the realization was far darker. Officers reviewed reports in disbelief. Kurita had broken through. He had faced almost no resistance that should have mattered. The American invasion fleet had been exposed, and yet he had turned away. Some Japanese commanders believed Kurita had lost his nerve. Others believed he was overwhelmed by chaos and misinformation. Kurita himself would later say he believed he was facing the main American fleet, not a handful of escort carriers and destroyers. The truth was simpler and more brutal. At Leyte Gulf, no one ever had the full picture. The battle was too big. The distances were too vast. Decisions were made in isolation, with fragments of information arriving too late to matter. For Japan, Leyte Gulf marked the end of an era. The Imperial Navy that had once shocked the world at Pearl Harbor was now reduced to scattered remnants. Battleships sat idle for lack of fuel. Carrier decks were empty. Experienced pilots were gone forever. From that moment on, Japan's Navy would exist only to delay the inevitable. For the United States, Leyte Gulf confirmed something many commanders already suspected. Naval warfare had changed permanently. Battleships, once a symbol of naval power, had been outmatched by aircraft, submarines, and radar. The war would now be decided by air superiority, logistics, and industrial capacity. And America had all three. But Leyte Gulf left scars that strategy could not erase. Survivors carried memories that never faded. Sailors remembered watching friends vanish under shellfire. Pilots remembered seeing ships explode beneath them, knowing men were trapped inside. For many, sleep never came easily again. And then there were the kamikaze attacks. Leyte Gulf had introduced a new horror. The first organized suicide strike stunned American crews. Pilots did not turn away. They aimed directly for the deck, flying through anti-aircraft fire with absolute determination. There was no warning, no negotiation, no defense that felt sufficient. Sailors who had faced battleships now feared individual aircraft more than fleets. The psychological impact was devastating. And yet, even this desperation could not change the outcome. After Leyte Gulf, the Philippines fell island by island. Japan's supply routes collapsed. Fuel shortages paralyzed what remained of the Navy. The ocean that had once protected Japan now isolated it. By 1945, the war had shifted closer to the Japanese mainland. Iwo Jima, Okinawa, bombers over Tokyo. The chain reaction that began at Leyte Gulf could not be stopped. Historians would later call it the death blow to the Imperial Japanese Navy. But numbers alone cannot explain why Leyte Gulf still matters. More ships fought there than in any battle before or since. More aircraft, more sailors, more chaos. Yet what defines Leyte Gulf is not scale, it is uncertainty. The battle proves that even the largest, most carefully planned operations can hinge on moments of hesitation, misjudgment, or courage from those never meant to decide history. It shows how easily victory can slip away, and how close defeat can come without anyone realizing it until it's over. Admiral Halsey would defend his decisions for the rest of his life. Admiral Kurita would carry the weight of retreat until his death. Neither could escape the knowledge that a single choice had shaped the fate of nations. The sailors of Taffy, three never asked for history to remember them. They did their jobs because they had no other choice. And in doing so, they saved an invasion, shortened a war, and altered the course of the 20th century. Today, the waters of Leyte Gulf are calm again. Fishing boats pass where battleships once fired broadsides. The sea gives no sign of the violence it witnessed. But beneath the waves lie wrecks that will never rise. Steel hulls, rusting guns, the remains of men who never came home. They rest together now, enemy and ally alike, silent reminders of battles so vast that it reshaped the world. The Battle of Leyte Gulf was not just the greatest naval battle of World War II. It was the last time the world would see fleets collide on such a scale. A battle defined not by perfect plans, but by human decisions made in moments of fear, confusion, and extraordinary bravery. And once it ended, the ocean closed over the wreckage, and history moved on, forever changed. If you want to uncover other classified attempts that textbooks ignore, subscribe to the Redacted War Archive. We're just getting started decoding the black ink.